Very nice welcome. That was a very interesting scenario. That was a full day take for about 10 seconds of TV, wasn't it? Very good though. Okay, we have a presentation. So I think the earlier speakers have set the scene really well for what I'd like to talk about. And my take on sustainability for today is all about how we might humanize high-rise buildings in a place like Singapore or a place like Hong Kong, and how we might make places more livable if we start to think that these issues matter. Handling density, how we deal with mixed use. And mixed use is a very popular term these days, but it's not easy. It has to be the right cocktail, the right blend of synergistic uses coming together. I'm going to talk a lot about landscaping because I believe very strongly in the synergy between landscaping and buildings, particularly in the model that Singapore paints for us as an identity going forward. 3D connectivity of taller buildings is an interesting one. I think it's probably a bigger commentary than today, but it's a very important point of this whole debate. And I think Jason has really set the scene in terms of why we think about pushing densities. What do we need to do? Why? Scarcity of land in a place like Hong Kong, rising sea levels. What does it mean? I think I've got a very similar view of Venice, and we'll come to that a little later. But what happens when density goes bad? What are we really talking about? We will all know about this amazing model of Kowloon Walled City, where thousands and thousands of people lived until the 1980s in very, very difficult conditions. I mean, as architects, we think this is a fascinating model, very intriguing, but imagine yourself living there, and it's not quite so great. If we also think about post-war tall building experiments around the world, a lot of these went wrong. This is an example in Glasgow. In fact, they knocked down the low-rise and then they knocked down the high-rise afterwards because that didn't work either. My take on this is that there was no placemaking. There was no time for placemaking. These buildings had to be put up very quickly. But there are good examples. So if we think about the Barbican in London, which was a development that emerged from that era, 1960s, 1970s, is a very popular place to live today. Okay, because of its location, but also because of the way it's cherished in a landscape sense, that the mix includes culture and other uses, and it's just generally a great place to live. And it's well connected to a great world city as well. And we know about the quality of great cities. Jason was keen to tell us about the density of European cities, and I absolutely agree with that. It's terrific to visit London, Barcelona, Turin, wherever, where heights are relatively low, although they're growing by the day in London, clearly. But we all know about the quality of what makes a great place. Gardens, parks, squares, terraces, great streets. Why do they always have to be on the ground? Why can we not animate the vertical spaces in the same kind of way? This is that same shot, but no water, right? And we didn't talk beforehand, right? So the right recipe for mixed use, it really is like cooking. You wouldn't put some horrible flavors together and expect to get a great dish. So mixed use has to be right. Is it live, work, play? Is it a bit richer than that? Is it about culture? Is it about education? Ivy mentioned health. It's important to get that blend right. And we must remember that we can't play God in this. The great cities and streets of the world are all mixed use, and they've evolved over time. We as master planners are expected to get it right in an instant, and it's tremendously difficult to do that. This is a wonderful place I've been to in Croatia. Many of you may know this. This started out as a Roman summer palace for Diocletian 2,000 years ago. It's been left alone to evolve as a place rather than being wrapped in tissue paper as a heritage piece. And now this is an absolute bustling piece of urban design which has grown naturally. So it's residences, workplaces, hotels, schools, education, markets, and this great centerpiece. So if you ever go to Split, I recommend you see the Palace of Diocletian. It's a living piece of historic mixed use. So let's move on to the landscape aspects. Green is good for you. We all know why this feels great. And there are scientific evidences to show that green makes us more healthy as well. You know, places to breathe, places to enjoy, places just to let your hair down and get away from it all. And one of our current projects in Jakarta, evidencing that, you know, our client on this particular job is very keen for us to exploit that at every level of the building to create a green building. And we know that 100 years ago, this idea of garden city movement was espoused, and yes, it was a great idea, even though it was only low density at the time. So welcome to Singapore, Asia's garden city, and we know how seriously Singapore takes its key projects and why gardens are important. And the amazing thing about this is that it never becomes boring. You know, every time we get a new project in Singapore, whether it's refreshing the approach to the airport, whether it's Jewel Changi Airport, whether it's Gardens by the Bay, upgrades to the botanical gardens, they're all great things. And they're not boring. They're fantastic and everybody enjoys them. The thing that underpins a lot of the good things in Singapore is the way the planning rules work, what we call landscape replacement and the lush rules. So developers in Singapore are encouraged to put green into buildings. And so what we find is they don't just go to the minimum either. They see that the value created by the green in the buildings, not just around the buildings, is valuable. It creates profit, it's worth doing, and it creates a fantastic green city. And all these are terrific examples of what I'm talking about. Green, many, many floors off the ground, publicly accessible, you know, 500-meter jogging trails in the sky connecting 7 towers, you know, is quite a unique thing. This is a very recent few shots of a hotel being built very close to our studio, where there are 3 open squares which go to about 30 or 40 floors off the ground, and each void is 10 stories high. Now, you literally wouldn't be able to do that in Hong Kong because you'd have to count all that space as GFA, and the business case would not prevail. So, thoughts on Hong Kong? Fantastic Asian global city. City of wonderful contrast. Mountains, density, coastlines, the works. But some of the contrasts work against the place, for me, a personal opinion. This shot is taken from exactly the same spot, turning 180 degrees. And we can see the landscape stops at the edge of the buildings, pretty much. Okay, there are parks and squares and gardens, but it ain't like Singapore. Why can it not be like Singapore, would be my question. Why can we not bring more green, Hong Kong as it is, my little thumbnail, to this, Asia's green city on the sea? Could we not do this? So, if we look around the city, yes, there are some great spaces. People start to introduce green into buildings in a fairly limited way, and our own scheme at Elements has a spectacular garden on the roof, which everyone engages with and allows for a view from 19 tall buildings looking down onto it. So we got to thinking, what if we had an internal competition for all our staff, which thought about building on a site in Hong Kong to the tune of Singapore, apply the planning rules of Singapore to a place in Hong Kong. And this fellowship that we started 2 years ago, named after our dear departed friend Peter McCaffrey, this year we decided to do this, to open it up to our global staff. And with our friends at Swire, we identified a site in Kowloon Bay, and Swire supported us and helped us judge the competition and so forth, and we moved on. Swire are actually building a building on this site, and they feel that it is a little bit limited in terms of the mixed-use element, the landscape and all the rest of it. And what could you do if you were a little bit freer with the rules? And this is an extract from the Singaporean rules that talks about landscape replacement, lush, and making sure the business case still works. And so these are, hot off the press, some of the examples of our students, of our people's work around the world, from 6 different studios, from here to London, Singaporean entrance, Beijing, Shanghai, Middle East as well. So, very interesting. A lot of green, a lot of public spaces in the air, a lot of public engagement with the buildings, lots of ground engagement with the buildings. These 2 are both from people who work in our Singapore studio. They only have to look out of the windows to take cues of what to do to make these buildings more human, and we can immediately see the mix and the places are really interesting. These 2 really work on what the mix of uses can be, how you might energize parts of the building high above the ground. There's not enough ground plane to go around with tall buildings. Why not create new ground planes above ground and think about commercial diagrams that work vertically in a commercially sustainable way? Ideas of generating a vertical park. I think Ivy mentioned this concept. A vertical park extending from the bottom of a building to the top and containing a whole variety of entertainment spaces, mixed-use spaces that will energize the workspaces behind. And a completely new encapsulated view of workspace at all, with a series of gardens in between. And then the one on the right on this shot really looks at the notion that buildings may, in the future, start to be connected one to the other by horizontal gardens. And why wouldn't that be a good idea? I can think of a whole lot of ideas, from earthquake stabilization to fire escapes to linking neighborhoods and creating town squares for high-level residential places. It kind of feels that there are some quite exciting ideas here that we ought to explore. And this one is a new interpretation of the Kowloon city itself. It took its inspiration directly from that, and some lovely sketches to demonstrate that. The one on the left here is interesting because you remember the 45-degree line in the Singaporean rules, from the eaves line to where the park can stop. The architecture on this one is generated purely from that, in a very unique form. And so it goes on. We've got a whole series of exciting and different designs to look at and enjoy and now share with our clients. And so for us, we feel this has been quite a success. It's all about really sharing places in the sky. And just to finish with that, here's an example from London where Raphael Benoy put this fantastic winter garden at the top of his building on Fenchurch Street. And to cope with that, the building gets bigger as it goes higher, and that makes sense in commercial terms because the floor plates are where the view is. So an interesting building. We can take places up, we can do placemaking down. The vertical connections are important. We can take the green up, we can take it down, and we should think about those vertical diagrams and making them sustainable and commercially viable.